All right, let's jump right into today's analysis. We're going to play the role of linguistic detectives to uncover what is honestly a massive historical mistranslation of a word most of us use almost every single day. That word is blessing. Now, based on an in-depth scholarly study of the text titled Blessings, we're going to conduct a comprehensive deep dive. We'll explore how centuries of English translation have totally warped our understanding of what it actually means to bless God, how God blesses us, and how a super common daily cultural habit might actually be completely unbiblical. Here's the roadmap for our academic study today. We're going to cover, first, the paradox of blessing. Second, we'll do some lexical and syntactical analysis. Third, we'll look at semantic directional asymmetry. Fourth, the English translation trap. Fifth, God is the absolute source. And finally, number 6, we'll tackle the myth of blessing food.
So, let's start right in with Section 1, the paradox of blessing. Think about this structurally for a second. We use the exact same word, bless, to describe God pouring out this life-sustaining favor onto humanity, but also when humanity turns right around and says, "Blessed be God." But here's the mechanical contradiction. According to the text Blessings, there's a fundamental truth found in Job chapter 35, verse 7, which asks, "If you are righteous, what do you give to him?" Right? If we, as humans, have literally zero power to give our Creator some kind of cosmic upgrade, what exactly are we doing when we declare, "Blessed be God"? To figure that out, we move to Section 2, lexical and syntactical analysis. To solve this paradox, we've got to establish a historical and grammatical baseline, and that means looking at the ancient Hebrew root words. We really have to look past our modern English dictionaries here. As detailed in the scholarly text Blessings, the ancient Hebrew word for blessing is barak, and what's absolutely fascinating is its physical etymology. The root, BRK, literally translates physically to knee or barak. You see, in ancient Semitic culture, physical posture was heavily used to express abstract relational realities. Kneeling or bowing was basically the ultimate bodily expression of deference. So when humans bless God, it is intrinsically tied to this concept of kneeling in homage. It's an act of ascription, recognizing a much higher source of power.
We can see this beautifully illustrated in texts like Psalm 103, verse 1. The text Blessings explains that when a human blesses God in this context, they definitely aren't actively adding any intrinsic power, holiness, or vitality to the Creator. Instead, they're performing an act of ascription. By blessing God, the speaker is metaphorically bowing their knee in submissive acknowledgement. They're basically positioning themselves as a dependent creature kneeling before their sovereign benefactor. They're taking a knee, so to speak.
Now, we also need to strictly distinguish this from simple praise. The scholarly consensus presented in Blessings argues that praising God uses entirely different Hebrew root words, specifically yada and hallel. Yada comes from the idea of throwing your hands up in acknowledgement, kind of like the physical energy you'd see at a concert, and hallel means to shine or to celebrate loudly. So practically speaking, blessing God is an active posture of submission and a declaration of His supreme worth, whereas praise functions more as the vocalized public celebration of God's verifiable acts and character in front of an audience.
Okay, moving on to Section 3, semantic directional asymmetry.
This is where it gets really interesting. That physical act of kneeling, it extends metaphorically in two completely opposite directions, totally depending on who is doing the acting. The document Blessings outlines this severe semantic shift, calling it directional asymmetry. When God blesses humanity, it is a downward movement. It's a generative, causative bestowment, meaning God is actively generating and giving life and tangible provision downward. Think of Genesis 12:2, where God says, "I will bless you and make your name great." But when humans bless God, the exact same root word shifts its mechanical application. It moves upward. Because humans obviously can't bestow power onto God, human blessing is reflective and submissive. It's an upward homage and a deep recognition of His supreme source power. But wait, you might be thinking, if barak means to kneel, does God literally kneel to us? According to the analysis in Blessings, this is exactly where anthropomorphism comes in. God doesn't have physical knees, right? Nor is He socially subordinate to us. Rather, the term describes His divine condescension. As Psalm 113 illustrates, the Creator stoops down from His cosmic height just to interface with frail humanity. The higher party lowers himself to enrich and empower the lower party. So the common denominator in both directions is simply the closing of the distance between superior and inferior through a very intentional posture.
Which brings us to Section 4, the English translation trap. Honestly,
A lot of the confusion we experience today stems entirely from the English passive voice. The English word blessed is used to translate two completely different Hebrew grammatical realities. In English, calling someone blessed almost always implies a past action that was done to them. When we apply that to God, this grammatical habit tricks our minds into thinking God is somehow a passive recipient of human favor. It creates this false impression that God and man are participating in the exact same transactional exchange, which just isn't true.
Think about the linguistic double duty we force onto the word worthy. For example, if we say the employee is worthy of a bonus, the employee is receiving a reward, right? That's passive reception. But if we say God is worthy of praise, God isn't waiting around to receive a bonus from us. It's an active declaration of his intrinsic supreme status. So as the text Blessings points out, when we say God is blessed, we aren't giving him a cosmic bonus. We're making an objective declaration that he is the very fountainhead of all reality.
The research in Blessings notes that traditional translations like the King James Version or the ESV unfortunately maintain this linguistic ambiguity. However, dynamic translations and Jewish prayer books like the Siddur bypass this grammatical trap entirely. By correctly rendering the term as source of life, fountainhead, or praise, they explicitly prevent the reader from thinking God is just a passive recipient of human charity. It correctly and beautifully frames the blessing as an objective recognition of reality. Let's transition to Section 5, God as the absolute source.
Looking at Romans chapter 11, the text Blessings highlights the Apostle Paul's prepositional precision to establish that God is the absolute origin of all reality. For from him and through him and to him are all things. Humanity absolutely does not enrich God. Instead, kind of like stating a fundamental law of physics, we're simply confessing where the water is flowing from. Translating the phrase as an acclamation of his identity correctly frames it as an objective recognition of reality rather than some kind of transactional exchange where we're supposedly giving him something he lacks.
I like to think of it like the sun. Acknowledging that the sun emits light doesn't mean you are somehow giving light to the sun, right? That's ridiculous. It simply means you are verbally aligning with the reality that the sun is the generator of that light. The source text emphasizes that using words like fountainhead or source when directed at God completely eliminates the transactional illusion that the Creator is somehow enhanced by our worship. He doesn't need our light. We are simply recognizing his brilliance. Furthermore, the manuscript Blessings reveals that New Testament writers explicitly maintained this strict lexical distinction when they translated Hebrew doxologies into Greek. They used entirely different words to ensure readers grasped this asymmetry. For instance, in texts like 2 Corinthians 1:3, God is called eulogitos, which means inherently praiseworthy and the source of blessing. Meanwhile, humans are referred to as eulogimenos, passive recipients who have been blessed. God gives while humans receive. The distinction is quite literally mathematically precise in the original language. And finally, Section 6, the myth of blessing food. Now let's apply this rigorous scholarly framework to completely deconstruct a daily cultural habit that, let's be real, you have very likely participated in. Popular culture wildly conflates two totally different biblical concepts. People sit down at the table and say, let's bless the food, which weirdly implies that their takeout is devoid of value until a human performs a ritual to magically infuse it with holiness. But just look at 1 Timothy chapter 4. Humans do not bless or empower the food. Rather, the food is received with gratitude or thanksgiving for what God has already provided and sanctified by his word. Let's be unequivocally clear here. As the text Blessings emphasizes, there are 0 verses anywhere in the Bible where a human being blesses food. Not a single one. Every single time the scriptures describe an action involving food and prayer, the directionality strictly follows the linguistic rules we just went over. Jesus and Paul never placed a blessing onto bread. They consistently looked upward to bless God, the true source, or to give thanks for the provision he supplied. In fact, the only time food or water is physically blessed in a causative, life-sustaining sense, God is always the active agent dispensing that blessing downward. The analytical review in Blessings points directly to Exodus 23, verse 25, to show exactly this. He will bless your bread and your water. Humans just do not possess the ontological power to infuse dead grain with spiritual properties. We simply lack the semantic knees, if you will, to stoop down and bestow life upon our meals.
Which leads us to a fascinating conclusion, and honestly a pretty direct challenge to our daily habits. Popular culture phrases like, bless this food, completely invert the biblical pattern. It turns a human expression of gratitude into an erroneous, almost magical ritual. It forces us to ask, having uncovered this massive linguistic trap, are we going to continue to invert the biblical pattern just out of sheer habit, or will we align our language to correctly acknowledge the ultimate unchanging source of all life? So next time you sit down to eat, ask yourself, are you trying to empower your sandwich, or are you ready to thank the fountainhead of the universe?